Nobody knows who this guy right here is, but he's one of my favorite people in the world. And we're going to make a deep dive video right now into apologetics and debating people and preaching your faith to people and being able to do it in boldness and not cowering away in fear. And Greg Koukl is like the king of doing this. So let's check this out and we're going to react to it.
Strategy. So, Greg, it's no secret that many Christians, and even myself included at times, we feel ill-equipped. We feel uncomfortable. We start to get nervous. We feel a little bit intimidated when people start to ask us questions that we aren't prepared for as it relates to our Christian faith. So if you could just take a little bit of time, as much time as you need, to tell us a little bit about your strategy for apologetics and how you recommend we as Christians discuss our faith with those who believe something different than us.
If you don't know, the word apologetics just means to be able to defend your faith. So when somebody's talking to you who disagrees with you, you being able to appropriately defend Jesus.
Well, Alan, I've been a Christian, just had my spiritual birthday like 50 years ago was when I became a Christian. It was my spiritual birthday was just a couple of weeks ago. And I've been in like over 90 different college and university campuses and done street work and all kinds of stuff. And I know this is the hardest time for Christians to engage the public with their point of view because everybody seems to be against them from top to bottom, schools, education, government, the media, everything, okay? And people are really hostile right now. And I learned something over those 50 years of work, and it really started coming clear to me at about maybe 20 years ago, little by little by little, and this is why I wrote the book Tactics, that the way that we've been approaching evangelism is not the same way that the New Testament folks approached evangelism. We are scared. We don't have a New Testament approach to evangelism, and we don't have a plan. And this is one of these are three of the reasons, actually, that people have a hard time out there. Now, the reason I wrote the book, titled it Street Smarts, is because the street is the place where you feel vulnerable. It's wherever you feel like you're under attack, that that you could get hurt in conversations. All right. And that could be with family. That could be with at work. That could be with other students. It could be a lot of circumstances. Right. And so consequently, we don't speak out. We just stay on the bench. All right. And what I've discovered is, first of all, being frightened and scared of out there is not surprising. The disciples were the same way. In Matthew chapter 10, Jesus is sending the disciples out in their first missionary journey, and 3 times in 7 sentences, he says, do not fear. I mean, the great apostle Paul in Acts 18 Jesus had to appear to him to tell him, don't be afraid any longer. Speak out, Paul. I have many people in the city. That was Corinth. Okay, so it's understandable that people would be nervous, that they would be frightened. All right. But Jesus said, there were 2 things that I want you to notice in Matthew 10. First, Jesus said, you have the Holy Spirit to help you. Okay, that's great. But he didn't say that at the beginning of his ministry. He was well into the time of training before he mentioned the Holy Spirit. At the beginning of his ministry, he said, follow me and I will make you fishers of men. So there's an educational process that the Holy Spirit uses to help us when we're engaging in scary circumstances. And that's why I put together Street Smarts, okay? Now, I mentioned that most people don't understand the New Testament means.
Real quick, before he goes on, I want to note for a moment that it's really important that, when I talk to people, they say, like, I want to share my faith. I want to be a good Christian in those, from that perspective, but I just don't know enough. So what he's about to address is going to respond to that challenge of just saying, I don't know enough about the Bible. And if you knew enough about the Bible, that it would maybe give you the ability to be way more confident. But knowing more about the Bible, although you should study these things and learn things like the Kalam cosmological argument, things like that, those are really important to know. They're not required for you to preach the gospel to people. And you can actually get people to meet Jesus before they ever even hear any sort of debates just by asking them a bunch of questions, which he's going to go over right here. Sorry, wrong screen.
Did my crop.
Yeah, Greg, I want to make a point about that because I think many Christians, we feel this pressure to be like a salesman where, hey, I'm not going to get a commission unless I close the deal, right? And so I've got this pressure as a salesman that I've got to make sure that you buy a car from me, right? Whereas it's a different approach. If I'm a salesman and I'm like, you know what, I'm going to get a commission, or our company is going to get rewarded as long as this person buys a car, period. right?
Right.
And so all I need to do is do my best to educate them as much as possible on the car and how this car can be a great asset for them and their family. And whether they buy now, a year from now, 5 years from now, our company is going to win because I've spent the last 2 hours telling them how great this car is. But then when they are ready to buy the car, they could go to another dealership and the other guy might try to do the exact same thing I am. And they're like, look, I don't need that spiel. I don't need all that. I'm ready. I know the car. This is the car I want. Here's my money. Here's a credit card. And the salesman's like, whoa, that was pretty easy, right? It's because all the work has been done on the front end. So I love your approach about taking the pressure off. We don't have to close the deal. It's about, as you say, putting a stone or a pebble, should I say, in people's shoes.
Actually,
Yeah, and what they're referring to is like your goal is not to bring somebody to Jesus. Your goal is to present truth to them, and then the Holy Spirit does the work of bringing them to Jesus.
I don't want to put a pebble. That's too small. I want to put a stone in their shoe. And I'm glad you mentioned that. By the way, the illustration's a great one. I've never used it before, but it's perfect for the circumstance. It isn't like we only get credit when we close the deal. We are out there as ambassadors for Christ. Mm-hmm. We are to do what we can do with the circumstances that God gives us. And I'll give some strategies on how to do that most effectively. But we don't have to worry about closing the deal. God is the one who does that. That's on his side of the ledger. It's not on our side of the ledger.
And this metaphor of putting a stone in somebody's shoe, me and my wife talk about this a lot, where it's like, if I can just get somebody to think and to really wrestle with a point, whatever the topic is, whether it's just belief in God, belief in Jesus specifically, whatever it might be, if I can just get them to really wrestle with that point, it's game over. Because they might not do anything today or next week or next month or even for the next year, but they will be wrestling and they will not be able to get that seed out of the ground, metaphorically, that's in their heart. Like that seed has already been planted and it's going to eat at them and eat at them and eat at them until they have to give in to it one day. And I'm only talking about people who actually have shown interest, or you can tell these things are real wrestles with them. Some people are just going to be like, screw this, I don't care what you have to say anyways. I'm not referring to those people. But for these people, and again, if you've preached the gospel a lot, you know what I'm talking about. That, man, when it sticks with them, it will eat at them and gnaw at them. And maybe you don't get to see that harvest. Maybe you don't get to see them come to Jesus, but you get to plant those seeds, which will produce its way to holiness one day in their life. So we're going to go to the first tactic that he talks about and the strategy in regards to preaching Jesus to people. That again, it's just not going to be similar probably to what you have probably heard before in the past.
So speaking of that game plan, tell us what is your tactical game plan? Give us the 3 steps, the questions specifically that you recommend we as Christians focus our conversation on so that we can be in the driver's seat and not feel so intimidated and uncomfortable in these conversations. What are those specific questions and what?
Okay. So you mentioned 3 steps. Okay. And I pretty much got this whole approach using questions. And this is the key to it all, using questions to get people thinking and to make a difference. And as you pointed out, to get in the driver's seat of the conversation. I mean, we think about our conversation right here. I'm doing all the heavy lifting, but I'm going in the direction that you pointed me in, Alan, because you're the one who's asking the questions. So when you use questions are gonna put you in the driver's seat, help you to manage the conversation well, and they're also going to keep you safe. I mentioned street smarts. The street is where you feel vulnerable. The way to feel safe is by asking questions. Once you ask a question, the ball goes in the other side of the court. The other person has to respond. And it starts out very simply. The very first step of the game plan. In other words, the first thing that I want to encourage anyone to do when they find themselves in a circumstance that might have a spiritual impact on a person, I want them to simply gather information.
Which, by the way, every conversation you have I shouldn't say should, because I don't want to be legalistic and say every conversation should, but you can turn every conversation into a Jesus conversation. What if I told you that I could turn this water bottle into a conversation about Jesus? Well, Jesus himself did this in John 4, right, with the woman at the well. So obviously you can use anything to bring somebody to Jesus. And if your life is all about Jesus, you can't even talk about what you did today without bringing Jesus into the conversation. So it's very easy to move a conversation into the realm of Christianity.
Okay, that's key. That's it. That's the first step, gather information. You got to get the lay of the land. You got to get intel. People are coming at you. They're pushing back with you. They're offering challenges to you. You need to know what the challenges amount to. You need to put the ball back in their court and get a little breathing room and let them talk more. Okay. So somebody says, so for example, what about the problem of evil? I say, what about it? They say, well, that's a problem for you, isn't it? I said, what's the problem? No, I want them to spell it out for me. Notice I'm giving myself some breathing room. I'm not trying to be coy. I am trying to be shrewd. I'm not trying to avoid things, but I want them to talk. Okay, notice that the questions that I asked were some form of the question, what do you mean by that? And that's the key question here. Somebody says, gives you a challenge, you want to gather information, and you ask the question, what do you mean by that? Or
here's why this is really important, because he doesn't go really in depth in this video about it. When you ask somebody, what do you mean by that? Or some form or variation of that question, you're getting, like he said, you're retaining, or you're gathering more information to be able to make the point that you're about to make anyways. But secondly, you might not even know what that person needs to hear in that moment, or what their point that they're getting at is, right? I don't know if somebody who's married or has a boyfriend or girlfriend, you're going to relate to this much more than somebody who doesn't. But you've probably gotten in some sort of argument with your spouse before, or your significant other, and you're going back and forth and back and forth. And then 45 minutes into the conversation, after the screaming has happened and the climactic moment has happened, everything kind of calms down for a second. You're just like, really, all I'm saying is, like, it kind of feels like sometimes you're just not really listening to me and really paying attention to what I'm trying to say in everyday life. And I just kind of wish you would take this more seriously. And then the other person goes like, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. I didn't know I did that. I'm sorry. I really will work on that. What if you started with that one sentence at the beginning, but instead you start with, well, if it wasn't for you leaving your socks on the floor, and if you just hung your towel up sometimes, and if you weren't just so selfish and cared about nobody but yourself, and then that's what starts the whole argument. But the whole thing that you really, really were starting the argument with in the first place was just that one point of, man, sometimes it just doesn't feel like you even listened to me. Now, that happened to be in the socks and the towel analogy, or, the examples, but that wasn't the point. Same thing with when people say something like, well, isn't evil a problem for you? What are you actually trying to say? Are you just going off of a strictly binary theological point? Are you going off of one specific Bible verse that you saw? Because I can probably easily just be like, oh, you just completely misunderstood that. Or is it because your grandma died of cancer? Because I'm going to answer all three of those examples in much, much different ways. If it's just theological, then I can combat that theologically very easily. If it's about specific Bible verse, I'll just go, oh, well, you probably read that out of context. Let's read the whole chapter to actually get the point across that the author was trying to get across. And then if somebody says, well, my grandma just passed away, this has nothing to do with theology at all. This has to do with their hurt and their misunderstanding of the character of God. Again, we're going to go in a completely different direction because I know why they're asking the question. So what do you mean by that? Lets me know why they're asking, right? So that's the first point is, it helps give you that kind of background. The second thing is, if you're anything like me, when you're talking to somebody about Jesus, you get really excited. And I get I'm just an animated person in general, I guess, but I get extra animated when I get passionate about my conversations about Jesus. And I remember I had this one person one time, and I was talking to him about Jesus. And I go on this whole thing about, again, the Kalam cosmological argument and then the morality argument. And I'm going way, way, way in depth on these things. And I'm talking to a 15-year-old, by the way. And they're just I just don't know why, if God's good, why people have to die of cancer or something along those lines. And I was like, I literally just wasted 45 minutes rambling about all of these things that I knew were good theological arguments, and they're great ones, but it had nothing to do with what this person was going through. And if I would have just let them talk and been slow to speak and quick to listen, I would have been able to have a really effective conversation with that person, and it would have gone half as long because I wouldn't have wasted all that time on something that I thought they needed to hear. I would have spoken about what they actually needed to hear, but I didn't let them talk, and I just talked the whole time. So that when they combated with that, I was like, oh my gosh, I've just wasted this entire time and just confused this person who's 15, trying to get them to understand the Kalam cosmological argument or the fine-tuning argument or something like that. And they're just they just went right over their head. So we're going to go to the second point now.
I hadn't really thought through this really well. So that's great. Number one. What is the second?
Okay, the second.
Approach?
And by the way, there is a place to come back with a refutation or a challenge to the other person's view or an answer to the challenge to your own view. But that's going to be the third step. And we're always going to use questions. So just an advance notice on that. Okay. Yeah. That's why the book is subtitled Street Smarts Using Questions to Answer Christianity's Toughest Challenges. Okay. So in the first step, we know what the person thinks or what the nature of their challenge is as much as we can. And when they answer your questions, what do you mean by that? And there's still some ambiguities, go ahead and ask more questions about that. Try to get as full of understanding you can of their own view. Okay. The second step is, now that we know what they believe, we want to know why they believe that. Okay. Why they believe that. So we're going to use some form of the question. Now, how did you come to that conclusion? Now, what are your reasons for that? Help me to understand why you think that's true. Okay. Again, this is a very easy question. Notice the Christian isn't advancing his view at this point. The Christian is just simply asking for more information. On the one hand, he wants to know what the view is. On the next hand, what are the reasons that the person has the view. So a person might say, well, the Bible's been changed. Okay. You ask some questions about what they think that means. Textual criticism is the formal area. You don't need to know about that. I know about that. Apologists do, but you don't need to know. You just need to know what he thinks it is. All right. And then the next question is going to be, okay, now, why do you think that it got changed the way you said it got changed? What are your reasons for that? Now, in these first two questions, they're gathering various types of information, right? There's a strange response that I often get, Alan, when I ask either of these two questions, and I warn people about it, okay? I get what I call the Simon and Garfunkel response. You probably know who those guys are, but maybe your listeners don't. If they don't, they should, because this is a 60s alert here. In 1966, they wrote this fabulous song called The Sounds of Silence. And sometimes when you ask a person, what do you mean by that? Or how did you come to that conclusion? Some variation of that. You get the sounds of silence. They don't know. You get dead air. And the reason is, and this is really important for your folks to understand, excuse me, is most people have not thought about their own views. They haven't considered the challenges to their view. They haven't thought about the reasons for it. They're just repeating what they've heard.
Here's why this is so important. We get so scared a lot of times that we're going to talk to that one atheist who has studied atheism his entire life, and that when we go and preach the gospel, we're just going to get destroyed, be a poor representation for Christ. And 99.9% of the people that you will ever speak to about your beliefs will have zero clue what they believe. And they will go off of one TikTok video that they saw that was 17 seconds long from user 82339 about why God doesn't exist. And it won't even necessarily make sense, but they'll just try to take, again, one Bible verse out of context, or say that God is evil, or say that the Bible was made by man. One of these just really weak canned responses. And if you just ask them what evidence they have for that, which is really what he's saying about why do you believe that, or what evidence do you have for that, then the entire conversation falls apart. And by the way, you haven't preached Jesus yet. You haven't studied any apologetics yet. You haven't even told them maybe that you're a Christian yet. So they're just, they might say something like, in his example, well, why does God allow evil? Well, what is evil? What's wrong with evil? What do you mean by evil? Well, doesn't the Bible say that, this is what I always hear this. Well, doesn't the Bible talk about God doing evil things? I don't know. Does it? What verse are you referring to? I will ask this all the time. I'll say, well, what Bible verse are you referring to? Well, isn't there that one time where God did that? And I'm like, I don't know. Is it? Is there? Like again, give me the example. Tell me about the reference your point that you're making. And immediately, I've never to this day never had a single person be able to follow through. Some people will be able to generically tell the story in a very atheist slanted way, but none of them can be like, oh, well, I'm talking about in 1 Samuel, or I'm talking about the story specifically where David spoke to the people of the Ai, and then still never heard that ever in my life, because they don't even know that much. They just heard that God was mean and angry in the Bible. That's all they've heard. The best that they might say is Noah and the ark. And I'll be like, well, what was bad about Noah and the ark? These people were all, doing all of these horrendous acts and whatnot. Or what's wrong with God doing whatever he wants anyways? And they'll just be like, well, I feel like that's just not cool. So your evidence for your entire belief or disbelief in God is because you personally just don't feel like that's cool? That's your reason for believing that? And what evidence do you have that that's a good reason for people to believe in something? And they immediately fall apart. So what he just said with the sound of silence is when you ask these people, what evidence do you have for your claim or for your belief system? Generally, people will just be like, that's just because it's what I believe. And it's like, okay, so you believe something that you have no evidence for believing. Right. Okay, got it. So do we both now understand why what you believe probably doesn't make a whole lot of sense as to why somebody else like me should be believing that same point as you? And from that, people will literally have an entire conversion, not to Christianity, but from atheism to agnosticism, or from agnosticism to a step closer to Christianity. This happens just from you asking questions, and you haven't preached the gospel. You didn't study apologetics yet. All you did was ask them questions. Now we're going to go to the third point that he's about to make here.
Okay, but let me give you an example of how this might play out if you're talking, say, to an atheist who says, well, there's no evidence for God. Okay, there's no evidence for God. I said, do you mind if I ask you a few questions? And actually, I've had this conversation a number of times. And one questioner at the University of Toronto came to the mic and challenged me on this, evidence for God. I said, do you mind if I ask you a few questions? Notice how I get permission up front, very friendly. No, go ahead. I said, the first couple are going to be kind of simple. And then we'll get to the important one. Okay. Do you think that things exist? Yes. Okay, good. I agree with you. Like I said, very simple. Second, the things that exist, have they always existed? Are they eternal, or did they come into existence? Now, nobody thinks that the universe is eternal anymore. 100 years ago, they did. Nobody does now. All the atheists believe in Big Bang cosmology. Now, I know Big Bang is controversial with some Christians, but don't worry about that. The important thing here is that both the Christian and the non-Christian believe the universe came into existence. That's all we need here. Okay? So, great. Big Bang cosmology. The universe isn't eternal, I tell the guy. Right. I agree with you. Okay. It came into existence. Okay. Now, here's the last question, and this is the one that matters. What caused the universe to come into existence? And I'll make it easy on you. There's only two options, something or nothing. How about that? Something or nothing. So what say you? Now, of course, the atheist doesn't want to say something caused it, because that's something outside of the material universe. He didn't like that one, right? That's got to be something that's pretty smart and pretty powerful, and got to be a person to initiate the whole process of creation, if you will. That sounds too much like God to them. They don't want to go there. But what's their only other option?
Nothing.
Nothing. Right. They have to say the universe came into existence with no cause for no purpose. And by the way, those two go together. If there's no cause, there's no purpose. You're left with a universe and life with no purpose. And you can make that point in your conversation maybe later on. I want to stick to this one thing, though. If he says nothing, which is what he wants to say, here's my point to him. Is that the odds-on favorite? I'm not trying to prove God exists. What I'm trying to do is show that it's the smart money is on God. The smart money is on someone who caused the universe to come into existence.
So this is what's called a philosophical argument. This means that you're not using the Bible to prove your point. Although these points are mentioned in the Bible, you're not bringing up the Bible to make your point. You're bringing up philosophy to prove your point of just saying that your own viewpoint is not intellectually consistent with yourself. And because of that, you have to acknowledge there's some contradiction in what you're believing right now. And which one of those things are you going to collapse on? In this specific example, you're either collapsing on there being something that created everything, or you're collapsing and saying, no, nothing created everything, and I'm going to stick to my guns that this doesn't make really any logical sense. Either way, they would be losing that argument. But mind you, one of the things I want to mention in this, and I'll probably do a part 2 to this video, but he's being really nice the entire time. He's even probably playing around, being goofy, making him laugh or whatever. This is really important in our conversations with people, because I feel like our understanding of preaching the gospel to somebody is this really combative, aggressive, zealous, like raising your voice version of Christianity. Man, I've never had that ever. I don't know how many people I preach the gospel to, but I've never experienced that where I started raising my voice at somebody like out of anger. Like, again, I get passionate, excited, but they know that I'm not being like, they don't raise their voice back because they don't think that I'm being mad or something. I just get excited sometimes, but that's evident when I'm talking to somebody. They know my intention is not that I'm mad at them or yelling at them. And it's very easy to be able to have a conversation with somebody unless your whole point is just to prove them wrong. And if you're going to go like this is a debate and I'm debating you, I'm going to like sock you 8 times in the face, then yeah, it's probably going to be really combative, a lot of name callings and things like that. But if you can just keep your conversation really calm, asking a lot of questions, really hearing their point so that you show that you value what they have to say and say, hey, here's why I believe in what I believe. And with my belief system says that if you are going to live the way that you live, that there is a place that God has set for you, and it's a place that you will eternally be, and it's called hell. And I don't want you to be there. It's a horrible place to be, and this is where people like Hitler are going to be, and I don't want you to be in the same place because of your sins or your lack of belief in God, because you think that you're smarter than him. Like, who do you think that you are, that you have all of this knowledge greater than God? Like, do you think that you're genuinely smarter than God? And again, you share hard truth in love with this person, but you can do it in a nice way where you're not being mean. They could still get upset, but just asking all these questions gets your foot in the door to having these conversations with people without you having any sort of theological knowledge on apologetics, on being a PhD in philosophy or something like that, or even being a good debater. Just asking a bunch of questions and see how many people get to come to Jesus because of your strategy of